Hello, we are now talking about psychological measurement. And by measurement, we mean a couple things, right? You think about the actual practice of measuring something, the questions and answers, but it starts with how we define or identify that variable, what we mean or what we intend to mean when we ask people questions about a concept. And then, of course, it's the actual measurement itself, the questions we ask, the Likert type measurement scale, the 1 to 5 sort of response format, things like that, right? So we're going to talk about ways to measure variables and a couple of the major concepts involved in measurement, the reliability and validity of measurement. We'll come back to this later on when we talk about results and analyses and things like that, because reliability and validity can be thought about in the beginning or the end, in planning our studies, making sure that we find and utilize reliable measures that are consistent in their use over time, and there's statistics to sort of index that, as well as valid measures that are measuring what we think we're measuring. We'll come back to that, but sort of the theoretical link between measure and concept. So ways to measure variable, of course, there's a variety of ways, right? So the tricky part is moving from that conceptualization or that theory to the actual practice of measurement, right? We call that operationalization or operationalizing a variable like happiness. We can operationalize almost anything, right? There's some examples there in terms of gender, wealth, intelligence. There's ways to index, as we say, or indicate someone's standing on those variables. But the measurement way of doing that is the operationalizing, right? The putting the concept into measurement terms. So if we think of something like negative affect or negative mood, affect is usually mood, right? So which operational is best? Well, there's different types. There's self-report, there's observational sorts of measures, physiological measures. So self-report might be something like, your answers to a Beck depression inventory or a questionnaire that asks a series of questions or offers a series of statements related to depression, right? And you subscribe to certain thoughts or you don't, or answer at certain levels, right? Negative comments might be something that's observational. You might code a partner, friend. I wouldn't do this with a spouse or partner, but code their negative comments, right? And then that could be an index of their negative mood. Physiologically, you could, of course, measure a host of different types of chemicals floating around in their bodies. And based on the type of study you're doing, one might be more appropriate than others, or some of that data might be easier to get for you than others. Going through IRBs, institutional review boards, they may not want you to take someone's serotonin, but you might be able to have them take a survey, right? Anyway, within these surveys, there's different scales that we use to capture these variables, right? In one sense, is categorical versus quantitative. All of that is quantitative in a sense that we're using numbers, right? But categories are more groups of numbers, like age categories, where quantitative is more pure numeric sort of digits or numbers, right, provided by respondents. And of course, within quantitative, there's ordinal, interval ratio types of measurement scales. We tend to lean towards the interval ratio, a number out of 10, a 1 on a 1 to 5 scale, whatever that might be. But the more pure the number, the more agile our statistical analyses are. And the more sort of stats we can perform on that, such as things like reliability analyses. The reliability of our scales or our measurement devices is really the consistency. So the key word there is consistency over time, consistency over test administration, right? So there's different forms of this, right? The major sort of rationale here, or the purpose here, is to identify how much what we might call true score variability we're capturing, or how much of someone's true score we're capturing, as opposed to what we might call measurement error. And of course, the systematic and unsystematic error, we'll save that for your stats classes for now, but error is not what we want to capture in our measurement devices. So the less of that, for whatever reason, the better, so that we can get reliable assessments of someone's true level of something like depression or whatever that might be, right? The different types of that Interrater, internal consistency, test retest, is really related to the type of measure we're using, right? So Interrater, if we're doing observational sorts of measures, like I talked about a second ago, those are, rating someone's behavior, counting the negative words if you're looking for depression. So it's someone counting, right? So the reliability is really the consistency of potentially the individuals counting, right? Do they notice the same amount of negative words? Internal consistency is related to survey type measures. So the different items on a survey, so there's 10 items on a survey, those 10 items should be asking about depression and getting similar answers in terms of people's responses about depression in a consistent way, right? So those questions should be tapping into the concept in the same way. They shouldn't be asking random things or getting at that concept in a way that doesn't seem to hang or to be consistent with those other items. And really that's indicated by people not responding to them in the same way, right? Anyways, the test retest is multiple administration. So if you take the SAT or an intelligence test multiple times, if it's a reliable test, it should be giving you the same response, right, across time for the same person, right? One way to look at this is looking at someone's scores on, let's say, a head circumference measure, right? That should only differ minimally. Really, the fault or the problem would be with the measurement device, potentially. Say you were using your iPhone to do the measurement. There's actually a tool within your iPhone, whether you know that or not, to measure things that you can look at through the camera. So maybe that wouldn't be too reliable, right, from one rating to another, based on maybe just the device. You can also think of that as sort of inter-rater reliability or agreement, we call it sometimes. If it's two people, let's say, counting those negative words or coding someone's level of aggression or some other characteristic like that, you might have, let's say Peter and Mark or Matt and Mark's ratings of, let's say, someone like Jackie or Jay. You can see that Mark maybe gave Jackie a 2 and Peter gave Jackie an 8. So that doesn't seem very reliable. They don't seem to be, consistent in their ratings of things, whatever that might be, right? Where if you look at, in case A over there, Mark and Matt's ratings of Jackie or Jay is pretty consistent there. So you see that sort of linear pattern emerging, showing consistency in their ratings, where in example B they're not very consistent, right? So Peter and Mark probably need to be trained or get on the same page somehow of indexing or identifying these behaviors, whatever it might be. So that's done really through correlations, right? Whether it's a scatterplot sort of idea or not, we're really correlating person 1 with person 2, like rater 1 with rater 2, or time 1 versus time 2 if it's test-retest reliability. Internal consistency is a little bit more complicated. We're doing a correlation between those scores on certain items and the overall score on the entire scale for each individual person across all the people taking that, right? Sometimes you could just do like a split half, like the first half of the scale, that sort of total versus the total for the second half of the scale for each person. So it kind of mocks up that they took it twice, sort of like test-retest reliability, but it's just using half of the items on the scale compared to the other half. Cronbach's alpha is a form of that, where they're basically taking all possible combinations of the items that you gave them, splitting up, odd, even, first half, second half, all these different ways, and then averaging that. This is the advantage of computers, which results in this Cronbach's alpha. So internal consistency is typically represented now as Cronbach's alpha, which is the average of all split half reliability estimates, or correlations between different split-ups of the test for each person, right? Anyways, validity is a little bit different than reliability. Reliability is consistency, remember. Validity is accuracy. So it's whether the measurement device itself is tapping into or measuring what we think it is, right? So with measurement validity, we're talking about capturing these abstract concepts in a way that's accurate, right? The most basic way, and some of the oldest ways of looking at this, is just face validity, or what we might call content validity. Face validity is whether it looks like what it's supposed to measure, right? So if a questionnaire is asking you about, your favorite color and your favorite food, or your attitude towards something, but not your job, then you would have a hard time believing that that's a job satisfaction measure, right? So that's a lack of face validity. Content validity is literally whether the content is asking about the concept itself. So if you think of something like a 220 exam, the questions on the exam should be representative of 220 course material, right? Or it's not content valid, right? And also if I'm asking about your favorite color, not content valid, and probably not face valid, right? Criterion and these other forms are really statistically related sort of forms of validity. So does it correlate with other things, right? Criterion being some sort of outcome, some other sort of group identification sort of way of saying that this measure is tapping into what you think because it correlates with things that it should correlate with, right? So a depression measure correlates with other depressive symptoms, right, of behaviors. Convergent and discriminant is kind of more related to when you're creating a test, that the pattern of associations makes sense. So convergent meaning that the pattern converges, that things correlate in ways that they should. So depression measures correlate with anxiety measures, and don't correlate with things like intelligent measures. So correlations that you expect, either positive or negative, are the convergent elements, making sense, right? Showing evidence that it's measuring what it should. A discriminant saying that it's not correlating with what it should not correlate with, right? So something like gender shouldn't correlate with an intelligence measure, right? So if you're creating a new intelligence measure, it should not correlate with gender, right? That's discriminant validity. Finally, so the point of this is that relationship and the reliability and validity, I mean to say, are both elements of a larger picture of scale quality, right? Reliability being the consistency, validity being the accuracy, both being important in their own way, right? Validity itself is really partially related to the quality of the measurement device. Some of that is really the internal validity, right? That we're confident that the study itself is done well, the measurement devices are tapping into what they are supposed to, and if there's manipulations, those manipulations are identifying cause and effect relationships. That's really important there. External validity is slightly different. When we think about external, it's that the way we're measuring or manipulating things in this study would relate to the real world, that are not fake or false, or only realistic in a laboratory sort of setting, right? So internal being the quality of the study, the sort of evidence of cause and effect, the external being how much that maps onto the real world, how much this study would happen in the real world, and the construct going back to that sort of other validity, sort of discriminate, convergent sort of element that we know this is what we think it is, right? That we're confident that we're measuring and manipulating what we think we are measuring and manipulating, right? So, anyways, the construct is being represented well. The sort of other aspect that's not mentioned here is the statistical validity, and this flowchart offered by your book includes it. Statistical validity is that there is some statistical evidence there, right? That there's a pattern statistically that holds up, right? So that's, sort of the criterion-related stuff, right? Otherwise, you just have the internal construct, external validity being that real-world map on, and then the statistical, that the correlations and statistics back this up, right? So I check out that flow chart in your book. Anyway, so face and concept, is it looking like what it's supposed to and representing the concept? And these sorts of things can be represented statistically, like I said, through things like criterion validity. So not just whether it looks like what it's supposed to, but does it correlate in ways that it should, right? So in this case, aptitude tests in sales, something that's very important in my field, looking to see if a selection test, let's say, predicts later performance on the job, right? That would show that it's a a good test or a valid test because it predicts something in the end. The known groups paradigm I reference is more about comparing things, like let's say a psychologist or psychiatrist, clinical diagnosis related to some test that you're maybe trying to explore, like the BDI, the Beck Depression Inventory. The Beck Depression Inventory scores people higher who have also been judged by a psychiatrist or psychologist as depressed clinically. It's identifying those known groups or distinguishing them with acuity, and we'd say that is a valid then measure because it's agreeing with the other measure, right? Distinguishing those groups in a systematic way. Anyways, I like this chart that your book also presents about subjective well-being, sort of looking at different groups. And so if you were looking at a new measure of subjective well-being, you could sort of compare these groups in that way, having some evidence that they already differ, right? So again, back to the relationship here, remember that validity is accuracy. So it's not the same thing as reliability, which is consistency, right? A measure can be less valid than it is reliable. It may not be as accurate as it is consistent, but it can't be more valid than it is reliable, right? It has to be consistent first. The most, I think, simple way to say this is that reliability is a necessary but not sufficient element of validity, right? You have to have reliability. Without consistency, you can't have accuracy. If you're all over the board or, not, asking the questions in the same way each time, you can't overall have an accurate assessment of that concept, right? So I like the dartboard analogy. In this case, you could think of the darts hitting the dartboard and them basically being scattered all over the dartboard. In this case, you would not be a reliable dart thrower, nor would you be hitting the bullseye. In this case, whatever that concept is you're trying to hit, right? So in that case, not reliable, not valid. If you were throwing darts and they were reliable, right, they were consistent, they would be hitting the same spot, but maybe not be valid. So you could ask people 1,000 times something in a consistent way, but if you're not asking them what you should be, you're not doing it in a valid way. And finally, if you ask questions in a consistent way, so let's say, do you feel depressed? Have you often felt depressed? Do you have a hard time getting motivated? Do you, have thoughts that are unhappy? If those are all consistent types of questions, and they're all about unhappiness or depression, then you probably have a reliable and valid measure of that concept, right? Anyways, hopefully this makes sense. Make sure and read your book and check out those charts that I mentioned, and I will see you next time.